Welcome back to another video. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the printing costs on KDP are changing in a few days' time. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run down the key things that are changing and what effects they might have on the royalties of your books in the future. So what is actually changing? So there's going to be an increase in the fixed cost for all paperbacks and all hardcover books. That is independent of size, but as we're going to find out later on, the size is going to have quite a big impact on the books from now on. There's going to be a new fixed page cost for paperbacks and hardcovers that have a trim size of over 6.12 inches by 6.9 inches. For the rest of the video, we're just going to call this 6 by 9 inches because that is a standard A5 book. So basically A5 and less is going to have this sort of lower fixed per page cost, and anything greater than an A5 book is going to have an increased per page cost. And there's also going to be a decrease in the per page cost of some colour printing books, and not all of the prices are going up, but generally the ones that most people publish in, which is the black and white books, will be going up, and I'll be going into a lot more sort of detail how much they're going up by and how much sort of the per page cost is later on. So when will these changes actually be taking place? Now this is all going to be happening on June the 20th at a certain time. It's going to be different all around the world, so it's in a couple of days' time, so it really is coming up pretty soon. So of course, because the fixed printing costs are going up, the minimum list prices for all your books are going to be going up as well. Now, one thing that I will say before I show you these is that none of your books should actually be close to this minimum list price before the changes or after the changes, because you really need to be making a royalty of at least sort of £1.80 plus to be able to advertise properly on your books, which is something that everyone should be doing. But just in case anyone is affected by this, I'm going to show you these changes now. Before I show you these minimum list prices, I'm just showing you these for books that are under 108 pages, because this is the sort of minimum threshold for a black and white book until it starts changing to sort of per page costs, where it gets a little bit more confusing, a little bit more individual per book. So these are just these sort of 108 pages, and that's black and white minimum list prices, which is the most standard sort of book on KDP. So for a book which is 6.9 inches and smaller, so A5 and smaller, so A5, A6 and so on, the new minimum list price is going to be $3.83. So if your book is listed at a price underneath this $3.83 mark, you're going to receive now $0 royalty in return for this, as opposed to what you're receiving before. And then for any books that are larger than 6.9, so these are your A4 books and things like that, the new minimum list price for a black and white book, 108 pages and less, is going to be $4.73. So as you can see, there is quite a big difference here. And one thing that you may be thinking is that in the past, the actual size of the book, so the actual trim size, whether it's 6 by 9, 8.5 by 11, or whatever it is, did not make a difference to the printing costs. Well, unfortunately, that is changing. And this is a change which is going to have a very big impact on a lot of authors, because KDP does not allow you to change the trim size once a book has been published. So if you go on your KDP bookshelf, you'll probably notice that Amazon is giving the option to do a bulk update on the price of all of your books. So this basically means that it will update the prices or change them according to the new fixed printing costs to match the previous royalties that you had on those according to the old ones. You know, it's going to up them by what, 20p, 30p, 50p, 50 cents, whatever it's going to be. So you're receiving the same royalties. But in my opinion, no authors should be doing this bulk update on all of their prices, and there are a couple of reasons why I think this. The main reason is that it's going to cause all your list prices to be really awkward numbers. Now, the reason I say this is because I think that everyone should list their prices at 0.99, £6.99, $7.99, something like that. But if you do this bulk update, it's going to increase the price of your books between about 25 cents to about 60 cents or something like that, depending on the type of book and the size of book. So of course, this is going to mean that all the new prices are really awkward. They're going to go from $7.99 to things like $8.54. When people are looking at prices, I really believe that they just look at the first number. I think that's the most important one. So they're going to see the $8 something, and the rest of it is not really going to be that important to them. So if a book is listed at $8.54 or it's listed at $8.99, I don't think it's going to impact the amount of people who would buy the book. However, you'll be losing out on sort of 10-15 cents of royalties, but over time, these really do start to add up. So I think if you're going to update the price of your books, which I would recommend doing for a lot of books, then you should up them by £1 or $1 to make them these sort of 0.99 at the high ones. You know, a $7.99 book now becomes an $8.99 book, and I really don't believe it's going to impact sales that much, because another part of this update is that everyone else is in the same position as you. So everyone else has to be sort of doing these calculated updates just as you are. So, you know, if the whole market shifts their books from $7.99 to $8.99, you know, this isn't really going to affect sort of how you stand with the rest of your competition. You know, you're still going to be the sort of same point, whether you were one of the cheap ones on the market or the more expensive ones or something like that. You're still going to be in a similar position. So hopefully what happens is that eventually over time, everyone slowly starts to adjust their prices according to this increase in fixed printing costs. So all the books go up by about £1 or $1 or whatever currency you're working in, and everyone still makes approximately the same amount of sales. Now, of course, some customers are going to be put off by this £1 or $1 increase, but I don't think many people will. So now I'm going to briefly show you how to actually calculate the printing costs using that pretty confusing table that KDP has given you. I will say you don't actually need to learn how to do this because they do give you a sort of calculator tool themselves, so you can just put the books in and it will spurt out the data for you. But I think it's always useful to understand where this sort of stuff is coming from. So the way that you can calculate your new fixed cost is, or your printing cost, sorry, is your fixed cost plus the page count times the per page cost. Now, if your book is 108 pages and less, if it's black and white, then the printing cost is simply just equal to the fixed cost. There's no per page cost for this. The per page cost comes into play when your book is over 108 pages long. Here we have our paperback printing cost table, and as I said before, it does all look pretty confusing, but I'll just briefly explain what's going on a little bit. So here in this left column, we have everything before June 20. So of course, before June 20, it didn't matter what size your book was, so this is just one column. And then here we have after June the 20th, so after the printing costs have come into play, and this is your regular trim size books. So these are your books which are 6 by 9 inches and smaller. This is the sort of printing costs and fixed costs that apply to these. And then this is the table for your large trim size books. So these are all the books larger than 6 by 9 inches. So if we just have a look at the .com market here, so before June the 20th, the fixed printing cost for a book of 108 pages and less was $2.15. Now this has changed to $2.30, so it's only a 15-cent increase, which is not too bad at all if your book is on the smaller side, so if it is 6 by 9 inches or smaller. But here where you see where the massive difference comes in is if your book is larger than 6 by 9 inches, the new printing cost is $2.84. So what's that, about 69 cents greater than it was before. Whereas if your book is smaller, it's only a 15-cent increase. So as you can see here, they really are punishing books which are larger. Now I'll just give you one example of how to calculate the printing cost of a book which is over 110 pages. This is where it is a little more confusing. So we have an 8.5 by 11 inch book, so an A4 book, which is the large trim size font section, which is 200 pages long. We focus on this little highlighted bit down here. As you can see, it's in the .com, it's in the large trim sizes section. So it's got a fixed cost per book of $1 and then per page cost of 0.017 USD. So what you have to do is you have to take this fixed cost, and then that is just simple, sort of that stays the same. And then what we do with this per page cost is we multiply it by the number of pages. So we'll do $0.017 times 200 pages, which is shown by this little formula here. So the fixed printing cost for this book is going to be $4.40. So as you can see, that is a really high printing cost, and you're going to have to list that at least sort of $9.99, $10.99 for us to make any sort of decent royalty on it. So as you can see here, KDP now really is punishing those larger size books, and of course, the larger page books as well. But if you have an A4 book now, which is over 110 pages, you're really going to have to pay a lot more in printing costs. So let's take a closer look at regular trim sizes versus large trim sizes. Now, as I've said a few times in this video, but I think this is the key takeaway from these printing cost changes, is that books larger than 6 by 9 inches are now being penalized quite heavily by KDP, which was absolutely not the case before. It was all exactly the same. So the rest of these numbers are all for books that are 108 pages and less. So this is where the per page cost doesn't come into play. It's just the fixed cost. So if it's a 6 by 9 inch book, and under, the printing costs in the US are $2.30 and the UK are £1.93. And if it's larger than 6 by 9 inches, the printing costs in the US are $2.84 and the UK are £2.15. They may be wondering why I've included two different marketplaces here, and that's actually because the marketplaces vary quite a bit on how much they increase the price based on the trim size of the book. So if you'll notice here, in the US, the difference is 54 cents. So there's a massive difference really if you go for a 6 by 9 book or if you go for an 8.5 by 11 book, for example. Whereas in the UK, the difference is only 22 pence, which I believe is probably about 28 cents different or something like that. So you are being penalized a lot heavier, almost twice the amount in the US as the UK, if you go for these larger size books. So that is something to take note of. If you have a book, for example, which sells much better to the UK, it's not nearly as big of a deal to make a book which is a larger trim size, because you won't be losing out on as many royalties compared to what you previously were. But if you have a book which is sort of sells 50-50 US UK, or is selling much better in the US, then you are going to be losing out on a lot of royalties if you do decide to go for this bigger book. Then as the page number starts to go past 110, then you do really get heavily penalized for having a large trim size. So if we quickly go back to this pretty confusing table, you can see here that for the regular trim size, the per page cost is 0.012 US dollars. Whereas for a large print size, or a large trim size, sorry, it's 0.017. So, it's almost, if it's about 45% increase if you go for that large trim size. So they really are penalizing you for going for these long page formats in a big size book. So what size book should I choose now that KDP has changed the printing costs, especially changed the printing costs for the different trim sizes? So of course, whenever possible, you should always try to pick a trim size of 6x9 inches or less. Now the pros, as we've already discussed, of a regular trim size are, of course, that there are much cheaper printing costs, 54 cents cheaper printing cost in the US if you go for a regular size trim compared to a large size trim. Now here's another point which probably some people might not be thinking of, but a smaller book means that you have a lot more page numbers. A 70-page A4 book translates to about 110-page A5 book. Now, one thing that I found in the past is that I've actually received some bad reviews on some shorter A4 books because they say that the books aren't long enough. They don't quite feel as big in their hands when they order them. They don't want to give them as a present as much. Whereas if they get the exact same book with the exact same amount of words and content in it, but it's in an A5 style, but it's 40 pages longer, say it's 110 pages, I very basically have never had a bad review based on the length of one of these A5 books. So increasing the page numbers because you've gone for a regular trim size also avoids some bad reviews in the future. And then regular trim size books, which are over 110 pages, generally still make a better royalty than a large print book under 108 pages. So if you had a book that was A4 and it was 108 pages, of course you're not going to cram this into 108 pages of an A5 book. It's going to be something more like 140, 150 pages, but you're still going to receive a better royalty on this longer A5 book, even though it goes over this sort of magic sort of 108, 110 page range. So for that reason, there's a lot of pros to go for a regular trim from now on rather than that larger trim. Now, although it costs more, there are still a few times where you want to use a large trim size for your books. This is if a smaller size would actually be detrimental to the quality or usability of your book. There are a few book types which really spring to mind that may be sort of damaged and harmed if they are made with a smaller trim size, and it may cause you to get worse reviews, which of course will have a worse effect on the royalties in the future than if you just went for that larger size and sort of bit the bullet and actually accepted you're going to either have to increase the price by $1 or you're going to have to get slightly less royalties. Examples of these books are sort of interactive activity books, so books where you have to fill things in, you have to draw, you have to write, color, anything like that. Then books for the elderly, which require large print. Of course, if you're going for a large print book, you really can't fit that much on an A5 book. So sometimes it is just better to go for an A4 book, just to make sure that the reader really does get the most out of the book that they can. And then similarly with the elderly, books for young children. These children also might require large print. They're going to require larger pictures and things like that. So these books would probably do better in a large trim size, but when possible, you should absolutely avoid this and go for that regular trim size. And if you do that, the royalties really aren't changing that much based on the printing costs. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you now understand what the changes to the printing costs actually are that KDP are going to be bringing in. Now, of course, no one likes it when the printing costs go up, but it was only a matter of time. The best way to look at it is to find the best strategies now to make the most amount of royalties in the future. And I think if you're smart about it, it really doesn't have to affect your royalty rate very much at all.